Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is week 3 of our African American Studies 119, a course that is titled Media, Digital Platforms, and Language Politics in Africa. And so today we turn to a pressing issue at the intersection of language, technology, and social justice. And this pressing issue is digital platforms and linguistic inequality, whose voices count online. And so that's the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Digital platforms and linguistic inequality, whose voices count online, whose voices count on those social media platforms of TikTok, Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, right? Now Meta, it's referred to as Meta, right? WhatsApp, right? That's what we're going to be discussing for the next 40 minutes or so. And so, as usual, Africa is home to extraordinary linguistic diversity. And this is something that we've seen with our previous lectures as well. And so it's estimated that there are between 2,000 and 3,000 languages, distinct languages that are spoken across the African continent, right? 2,000 to 3,000. And so these languages carry histories. Yeah? They carry worldviews. They carry collective memories. Right? And yet, when we step into the digital realm, right? We step into the digital realm. This rich multilingual tapestry, yeah, shrinks dramatically. How is that, right? This linguistic tapestry of 2,000 to 3,000 languages, right, shrinks dramatically. And so only a handful of African languages appear visibly on platforms such as Google, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Wikipedia, right? Only a handful of them out of the 2,000 plus that we are talking about here. And so the question before us is which voices are amplified in the digital sphere and which ones are silenced? And what does this imbalance, because it's an imbalance, right? What does this imbalance mean for knowledge, for cultural survival, and political participation in Africa? What does that mean? When only a handful of African languages dominate the digital spaces that we just mentioned, while neglecting, I would say actually 2,000 plus other languages, because we gave an estimate of 2,000 to 3,000. And so, section 1 of this lecture gonna be talking about digital platforms as new gatekeepers. Remember, in our previous lecture, we talked about radio being a gatekeeper. Historically, has been a gatekeeper where colonial languages have dominated the airwaves of various African countries. But here, we are talking about digital platforms that we mentioned being new gatekeepers. And so let's talk about that for some few minutes. So we will begin by recognizing that digital platforms have replaced traditional broadcasters and print media as central gatekeepers of language. Yeah? We have content creators out there on these platforms giving us news about what is happening across the entire African continent, right? And they have million subscribers, million followers, a couple of thousands likes here and there. And so they happen to be the new gatekeepers out there competing with the traditional media platforms that we are used to. And so in the colonial period, European powers privileged colonial languages of English, French, Portuguese, and by extent Arabic. And that's something that we saw with the radio in the lecture that we had last week. And so in radio, in schools, in newspapers, these are languages that have dominated these platforms for a while. But today, corporations and algorithms play a similar role online. They play a similar role when it comes to digital platforms of YouTube, of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, TikTok, name them. And so platforms like Google and Meta make strategic choices about which languages to invest in. It's a business strategy. For example, Google Translate supports Kiswahili. It also supports Yoruba. Google Translate also supports Hausa and Amharic, right? But not Wolof, Ewe of Ghana, or Luganda of Uganda, despite their millions of speakers. And so Wikipedia has vibrant editions in Swahili and Yoruba, but languages like Fulfulde right? Spoken across more than 10 African countries for full day, have almost no representation. Minimal, minute, non-significant representation on these social media platforms that we are talking about. And so consider TikTok in Kenya. Okay? Let's forget about Google and Meta for now, and have another example of TikTok in Kenya, where Sheng, we've talked about Sheng before, the dynamic urban slang that mixes English, Swahili, and vernacular local languages. And this variety, this Sheng variety, thrives among youth creators, youth content creators. Yet Sheng videos rarely reach a global audience, and partly because TikTok's recommendation algorithms favor English. Algorithms, always going back to that. That's the elephant in the room when it comes to the popularity of African languages in these social media platforms. So thus, even when African youth innovate linguistically, global platforms still rank some voices higher than others. And so with that, allow me to get into section 2 of this lecture, where I'm going to be talking about unequal access and representation. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes here, quite a couple of them. And so let's travel across the continent, right? I like giving you this journey motif of traveling across the African continent. So let's travel across to see how linguistic inequality plays out. And I'll start with Ethiopia. Ethiopia. Did you know that Swahili people also call Ethiopia as a country Uhabeshi? Uhabeshi. And Ethiopians may as well be called Wahabeshi in Kiswahili. And so Ethiopia is a multilingual country with Amharic, Oromo, Somali, and Tigrinya among its major languages. And this is something that we've seen before. Pretty much in the lecture that I had in the spring. The language and social issues in Africa course that I taught during the spring. We saw that there are 4 major languages in Ethiopia. The languages of Amharic, the language of Oromo, Somali, and Tigrinya. And yet on Facebook, moderation was historically available only in Amharic. And during the Tigray conflict, right? It was a major conflict in Ethiopia. Harmful speech in other Ethiopian languages went unchecked. And this unchecking fueled violence. And this shows how the absence of adequate digital support has deadly consequences. Deadly consequences. And after Ethiopia, let me give you the example of Nigeria. Nigeria in West Africa. They call themselves the giants of Africa. It's a highly populated country with over 150 million people in that country, right? And so with Nigeria, with its more than 200 million people and over 500 languages. Can you believe that? 500 languages in one single African country. Nigeria illustrates stark hierarchies, right? Stark hierarchies. English dominates Twitter, they formerly called Twitter, but now X. So English dominates X and Instagram platforms, while Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo have carved out spaces through YouTube comedy skits, Nollywood films, and blogs. Look at that hierarchy. And then we have smaller languages like Tiv, like Nupe or Ijo, remaining digitally invisible. So a Tiv child, for example, who goes online may never see her mother tongue represented. May never. Because we have those hierarchies. English on X, on Instagram, right? Stops there. And then we go to Nollywood, comedy skits, and blogs. That's where you'll find Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo, right? And then these are the small languages never represented anywhere. And so with that, let me give you the third example of Tanzania and Kenya. They happen to be twin countries because they share a language, they mostly share a culture, they are neighbors, right? And they are part of the so-called East African Federation. Have you heard about that? East African Federation. At some point, we're going to talk about that, the East African Federation. And so in Tanzania and Kenya, Swahili enjoys relatively high visibility. And thanks to state backing and Pan-African recognition, right? Swahili happens to be one of the few African languages with a Google interface, And still, platforms such as Google Translate produce awkward translations. Awkward. reminding us that the technology does not yet respect Kiswahili on the same level as English or French. And then meanwhile, languages such as Gikuyu, I mean, Gikuyu is spoken by more than 20% of the Kenyan population, mostly around Mount Kenya, Central Kenya region. So languages such as Gikuyu, Kamba, that I happen to speak, Sukuma, or Luo, are mostly confined to local WhatsApp groups or local radio station pages. Think about that. And so, let me give you the fourth example of South Africa. In the language and social issues in Africa class that I had in the spring of this year, 2025, we saw that South Africa has 11 official languages. 11 official languages. Thus making South Africa to be one of the most multilingual countries in the world. But the digital scene tells a totally different story. It tells a totally different story. Even with South Africa being the leading economy. I mean, one of the leading economies in the African continent. So English dominates Twitter. It dominates Facebook. It dominates LinkedIn. In that country. Afrikaans has a decent presence. And this is due to older white communities that live in South Africa. Allow me to mention that. While isiZulu and isiXhosa have moderate visibility. And yet languages such as Sesotho, isiDembele, the language of the Ndebele people, and Shiveda. Shiveda is another language that is spoken in South Africa, if you are not aware, are barely visible online, even though they are constitutionally equal. And over to my fifth country of Senegal in West Africa. In Senegal, Wolof happens to be the language of daily life. It happens to be the language of music and the language of politics. Yet, the digital landscape often privileges French. It often privileges French. And on YouTube, Wall of rappers like Didier Awadi is a pretty popular rapper in Senegal. Didier Awadi have carved out niches, but French remains the lingua franca of official websites. Lingua franca of official websites, online banking, and state communication. Very important institutions that are dominated by French in Senegal. And so across Africa, the same pattern emerges. The same pattern emerges. Colonial languages dominate. A few African languages carve digital niches. And the majority remain unheard. They remain in the backstage. And so this inequality echoes and reproduces broader patterns of economic and cultural power. And so allow me to get to section 3 of my lecture, where I'm going to be talking about structural and algorithmic barriers. Structural and algorithmic barriers. And the question here is, why do these inequalities persist? Why do they persist? Number one is economic logic. Economic logic, where corporations invest in languages with global advertising potential. English, French, or Arabic attract investors. Kikuyu may attract local investors, but not necessarily global investors. And so Kikuyu, Bambara, Kamba do not attract the so-called global investors. And number two is data availability. Data availability. Machine learning systems require massive text corpora. They do. They require massive text corpora. And English happens to have billions of digitized texts. Billions of them. Yoruba or Wolof have far fewer limiting artificial intelligence accuracy. Right? If you try to use ChatGPT, for example, with Yoruba or with Kamba, and ask ChatGPT to translate a certain text from English or French to Luo or to Meru or to Sukuma or to Lingala, there will be discrepancies. The translation may not be the actual translation of the original text. It might have errors, and so you have to do some proofreading, some editing before you consume the translation, or before you submit the translation where it was supposed to be submitted. And this is because those languages that I mentioned have far fewer digitized texts, and hence limiting AI's accuracy, artificial intelligence accuracy. And three, allow me to give you the third barrier, which is script and orthography. Script and orthography. Some African languages, like Nkho, that is used for Madinga languages, right? Or Ajami, that happens to be the Arabic script that is used for Hausa, Wolof, and historically Swahili. I mean, Swahili has adopted the Latin alphabet, but it was historically documented in Ajami script. And so these languages or these scripts face digital hurdles. They face digital hurdles. When it comes to fonts, when it comes to keyboards, you have to generate special keyboards, computer keyboards for these languages. And display are not standardized. They're not standardized. So script and orthography limiting a lot of these African languages. And four, right? It's four. We have the issue of algorithmic bias. Algorithmic bias, where platforms reward shareable content. These digital media platforms rewarding shareable content. English and French posts often. They do post often. And the same thing applies to maybe Arabic or Portuguese or a couple of other European languages up there. And so this discourages content creators from using smaller languages, smaller African languages, to do their content creation on social media, on these platforms that you mentioned about, on YouTube, on Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp, Instagram, name them. Algorithmic bias, that's the fourth hurdle that we talked about. And so the result is a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop. The more visible a language is online, the more incentive there is to use it. And the less visible a language is online, the less incentive there is to use it, and the less data platforms have to improve tools So it's a wake-up call. Africans, go out there and start using, popularize your African languages on social media so that we can have lots of data out there that can be used in artificial intelligence, in machine translation. And so with that, allow me to get into section 4 of this lecture, where I'm going to be talking about resistance and innovation. So, don't get me wrong. Even with all these invisibility of African languages on social media platforms, African communities are not passive. They're not. They've never been passive. They are actively reshaping the digital space. Wikipedia Africa, for example, has a Wikipedia project and Afro curation events in Johannesburg and Lagos that are training youth to create entries in Kiswahili, in isiZulu, and Yoruba. Wikipedia Africa. And the second one is localization. Localization, where Google, Meta, and Microsoft have rolled out Swahili and Hausa interfaces. South African developers are actually working to expand isiZulu and isiXhosa on Google and Meta and Microsoft. And then when it comes to creative use, we have Kenyan youth exporting Sheng language, Sheng slang globally via TikTok. And in Senegal, rappers are using Wolof to reach local audiences. In Mali, hip-hop artists rap in Bambara, right? They rap in Bambara. And so, with digital archiving, platforms such as yorubaname.com in Nigeria preserve Yoruba names and meanings in Yoruba. And the African Storybook Project publishes children stories in Luganda, Sepedi, and Shona, providing free multilingual resources. And these grassroots efforts challenge linguistic inequality and demonstrate the potential of African agency in shaping digital futures. And before I get to the conclusion, allow me to talk a little bit about this question that has been bothering us for many years, and specifically for this lecture, right? The question of whose voices count? Whose voices count? Or whose voices count? Whose voices count on these social media platforms? Primarily, those who speak English, those who speak French, those who speak Arabic, and a handful of other widely spoken African languages such as Kiswahili, Hausa, Yoruba, and isiZulu. Those are the voices that matter online on these digital platforms. But the majority of languages such as Tsonga, my own Kamba language that I spoke at home with my parents, or Shona, remain on the margins. They remain on the periphery. And this isn't just about communication. When a language is excluded digitally, so too are its speakers from access to information, economic participation, and political voice. And to be invisible online today is to be excluded from tomorrow's knowledge economy. It's an entire knowledge economy out there that excludes those who don't speak certain languages. And so to conclude, I'd say that digital platforms act simultaneously as bridges and barriers, right? That duality. Bridges and also barriers. They enable Swahili or Yoruba to be heard globally while silencing hundreds of other African languages. And the challenge before educators, policymakers, and technologists is ensuring that Africa's linguistic diversity does not vanish into digital silence. That's the challenge. That's the challenge before us, before policymakers, before us educators, before technologists, of ensuring that Africa's linguistic diversity, the more than 2,000 plus languages that are spoken across the African continent, do not vanish into digital silence. And so in African languages, if African languages are to thrive in the digital era, we must insist on inclusive design, invest in local language technology, and support communities creating content in their mother tongues or in their first languages. And it's only then can digital platforms reflect the true multilingual heartbeat of Africa. It's only then, only when all these languages are brought on board, that the many digital platforms that we talked about will reflect the true multilingual heartbeat of the African continent. And so with that, allow me to thank you for being part of this lecture today. I hope you gained something. And so next week, we're going to be talking about something different. And I look forward to having you in my class next week when we're going to be talking about language identity and representation, film, streaming platforms, and digital activism. That's our week 4 topic that is scheduled for next week. And so until then, I hope you have a wonderful evening and looking forward to seeing you in class next week. Goodbye.